Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Welcome to this episode of All Things Policy. Today, we're going to be discussing the US Congress and the making of India-U.S. relations. I'm Vanshika Saraf, a research analyst at the Indo-Pacific Studies program. And I have with me today Abhishek, also from the Indo-Pacific Studies program. We're going to be discussing how the US congressional perspectives have changed towards India right from Indian independence till now. So let's jump right in. Abhishek, we usually see the US president as the face of American foreign policy. But how central is the Congress in foreign policy making, especially in the case of India-US relations? And has it shaped the relationship a lot more than we acknowledge or we're aware of?
Firstly, thank you for having me, Vanshika. So, as you have rightly pointed out, President has always been the face of US foreign policy, and that to an extent was what was intended by the makers of the US Constitution as well. But the makers have also given the Congress a very strong role in balancing the presidential authority in that regard, with the Article 1 establishing the US Congress as the first among equals in branches of government, followed by the executive. So, if you look at it from that perspective, in terms of foreign policy specifically, the Congress is required to authorize funds. It is what regulates foreign trade with other countries. It is what ratifies deals with other countries. It is also what has the official authority to officially confirm, the appointments that are nominated by the executive. It also has the sole power to declare war, and more importantly, it conducts oversight on the larger, federal aspect, all the federal institutions as well. So, if you look at it from that sense, the role of US Congress is definitely underrated. And this is especially due to the fact that the role of the president has largely been consistent since the end of the Second World War. But the role of the US Congress has been evolving and changing, having gone through different phases, of evolution, with different congressional reforms taking place, be it in the 40s, be it in the 70s, be it in the 90s, or even the most recent times. So, having said that, I think so all of these powers that I have said the Congress has, the president has in some way or the other chipped away on them, right? For example, there is the sole executive agreements where the president uses his own discretion to enter into treaties and treaty negotiations with other countries without congressional approval. We also have authorization of use of military force legislations, which are AUMFs, that were used extensively in Iraq and Afghanistan, and also against different terrorist outfits in the region. So that was the result of war on terror. And even before that, we have war powers resolution of 1973, which basically allows the president to enter into a conflict without congressional approval, but president has to notify the Congress within 48 hours of deploying troops, and the operation has to end within around 90 days. If not, the president has to gain official congressional approval. So these are the broad areas where the presidential authority has gradually chipped away on the congressional power. But even today, the Congress has till today it has been playing a very central role in deciding foreign policy, especially in relation to India. Because especially if we look at year 2025, we can see this, wherein congressional authority was vital in, say, keeping Quad alive in an era where the administration was kind of ignoring Quad as a partnership, and focusing on focusing on the trade aspect of it more, and as part of the larger trends within Trump administration of going away from its partners, right? So yes, so largely that is why I think it is safe to say that the role of the Congress has been somewhere underrated in foreign policy of the US, and also in determining India-US relations.
Right. So now, if we actually track India-US ties 1947 onwards, how has the evolution of Congress itself, influenced how India was perhaps treated?
So, Congress and India-US relations in terms of evolution, they both of them have a lot of overlapping years or a lot of overlapping instances. For example, the year 1947 was the year India got independent, but year 1946, just 1 year before that, was also the era where Congress conducted its own set of reforms as part of the Legislative Reorganization Act of 1946. So the larger idea during that time was that before that, the executive and legislative branches of the government, they played a equal sort of role. And gradually, because of the Great Depression and the Second World War, Congress determined that it would be wise for it to delegate some of its responsibilities to the president, because these situations were of crisis and required quick action. And that is how slowly the congressional authorities started getting chipped away initially, or getting delegated by the Congress. Then this led to an explosion in federal agencies as well. If you look at domestically, internationally, after the end of the Second World War, US emerged as a superpower from its post isolationist era. And it sought a vision wherein it would be involved globally. It would display its influence and enhance its influence globally. So this was the larger vision of the larger leadership of the time. And catering to this vision, the Congress also had to entered into a sort of race with the presidency, wherein the executive had a lot more funds, a lot more authority, and the Congress had limited set of authority and funds, be it to conduct oversight, be it in terms of the actual human resource required, or even financial resources. And Congress also had to deal with a lot of internal divisions. So these were the multiple aspects of it. So with the Legislative Reorganization Act, the Senate and the committee system, this era is called the committee system government. Because the Senate, especially in foreign policy matters, took a very dominating role with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and the committee system in the Congress in general also took a leading role. The problem with this was that Senate is a smaller body as compared to a House, and its committees are also the committee system within Senate is also centered around the specific US interests rather than actually trying to cater to everything that US is supposed to focus. And since this was 40s and US was still underway, learning to be that global superpower, that was clearly reflected in the broader committee system of the 1940s. If you look at it from that angle, I think this was the reason why a country like India was, say, sidelined in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee discussions, as opposed to a country like, say, Soviet Union, or even to an extent China, that took a greater sense of discussion in the committee. So as long as this committee system existed, India was largely sidelined. Its role was viewed as a country requiring aid, and a lot of members viewed it as more of a nuisance that resisted both that in the guise of, say, non-alignment, was in some way favoring the Soviets, and that kind of rhetoric dominated that era. Then we come to the 1970s with the Legislative Reorganization Act of 1970. This basically chipped away the powers from the committee system and the more senior conservative legislators, and gave it away to subcommittees and more younger legislators. And this allowed more of a regional focus to develop within Congress. As we see in the case of India, a lot more discussion focused on India happened during this time, because this was also the era with the Bangladesh Liberation War of 1971, and also India's nuclear tests, and multiple things happening in the Indian subcontinent at large that led to discussions within Congress. And this was also one of the primary eras where a lot of members began supporting India on strategic issues. In support for India existed in the 70s, in the 40s as well, but that was largely focused on aid related discussions. Then we come to the 90s, wherein more informal structures took a central role in Congress, as the power of these formal committee and subcommittee systems was again chipped away by a Legislative Reorganization Act of 1994, also known as the Newt Gingrich reforms and the contract with America. And with this, Congress entered into a mode where caucuses and lobbies became a central aspect. And I think this is where India has actually stepped up and invested in diplomatically, at least in developing India-related caucuses, with the first India caucus emerging in 1993, right after India's liberalization reforms. And the first Senate India caucus emerged in 2004 and became the first country-specific caucus in the U.S. Senate. So this was also running in parallelly with the rise of Indian diaspora and larger business representation of India. So I think India. So that is how the larger evolution of U.S. Congress has been in line with India-U.S. relations. And I think the core aspect to identify here is that it is India that was reluctant initially to adopt its strategies in dealing with the evolution in the Congress. But I think in the more recent years, India is more quick, India is more agile, it is more reactive to adopting to these frequent changes that happen in the Congress.
Right, that's very interesting, and thanks for the expansive discussion. So, you mentioned a few decades, you mentioned the 70s and the 90s. So, let's look at very critical turning points there. We saw nuclear sanctions in 1974, again in 1998, and but there was a shift in the next decade with the 2006 Hyde Act after civil nuclear cooperation between the US and India. So, at these points, how and when did you think the Congress constrained the relationship, or alternatively, do you think how did it decisively enable the relationship?
That is an interesting question because we look at India-US relationships through these landmark agreements and landmark situations. So firstly, I think if we start with the 1974 nuclear tests, the Pokhran one, India was before that viewed as this rather poor country with probably regional ambitions at best with the Bangladesh war. And Democrats and the what they call the Doves largely supported India in that sense because they viewed India as a humanitarian responsibility, firstly, and also a partner in the larger, as a democratic partner in the larger fight against the Soviets. But 1974 was critical because a lot of these Doves and a lot of Democrats were dominated by the influence of the non-proliferation lobby. And with India conducting these nuclear experiments, India lost that kind of support. But what 1971 and 1974 also ensured was that India gained the support of some amount of hawks, some amount of people who thought India was a softer country. They viewed India through a Gandhian lens, and they just assumed that India would be a largely softer country. But these two acts allowed some kind of tonal shift within the Republican Party, which slowly began supporting India. I think 1974 is that kind of important watershed moment for the relationship there. But for at least next almost a decade or so, India was treated as a pariah within the US Congress, as seen through different legislations, because there was like a frequently very strong attempt within the Congress to curtail any executive action that would further cooperation, especially in the area of nuclear security and nuclear energy and defense cooperation between India and the US throughout 70s and 80s. But since 80s, India also since mid 80s at least, India started gradually liberalizing its economy. It started taking steps in that direction under both the later period of the Indira Gandhi government and also the Rajiv Gandhi government, and obviously it peaks with the Narasimha Rao government and the liberalization reforms. So Congress was more receptive to India and started viewing India as a partner during this time. And this was more true because Congress already experienced this kind of a relationship with China, which had recently opened up and shifted away from Soviet influence. So Congress was hoping that something similar would happen to in the case of India as well. And this resulted in a largely positive tone that Congress took towards India during this period. But again, this was largely dominated by Republican members and some elements of moderate Democrats. A lot of more progressive, newer leaders, especially within the Democratic Party, were critical of India's human rights situation during that time. With the Punjab situation, with the Kashmir situation, people were extremely concerned, and this was also the era where emergency was declared. So I think that was also an important component that moved from 1970s. And But by 1990s, the rhetoric had gradually been changing. This was also because new members of Indian diaspora started entering the lobbying business. The diaspora grew, and the people-to-people understanding of India and US, it also started showing its impact in the Congress itself, and the relationship gradually softened throughout the 90s. But then the 1998 tests was another important threshold in the relationship, because US Congress did not primarily understand how exactly to view this. Was this a challenge to the United States and its post-war system and post-war hegemony, or did it have some other kind of implications? There was a lot of confusion in that regard initially, but India was very quick to react in that sense, and through its diplomatic effort and through lobbying effort, through a strong combination of both of these, the rhetoric was mellowed down within 18 months. Within 18 months, the Congress again started pigeonholing any legislation that required guardrails on India's nuclear program and the nuclear cooperation. And with this all culminated in Prime Minister Vajpayee's visit to the US and his address to the US Congress. So this basically proved that what India basically did there was that India basically assured the US Congress that this was not as a challenge to the US system. Instead, if anything, this would favor US system, as this would actually deter China that was growing at that time. Although there weren't as much of concern regarding growth of China as much as it is today, but there were genuine concerns back in the day, and this was also in response to Pakistan's nuclear program, and this was and depended primarily and entirely based on India's regional interests and not any international aspirations as such. So when this was clarified to the Congress, I think the relationship moved forward from that. And I think from there on, the power of the diaspora, the power of the India caucuses began exercising itself very strongly, because initially the entire nuclear deal was believed to the Congress was believed to be the biggest hurdle for the nuclear deal, and India started working on that with 1993 House India Caucus, which had about 120 members. And then in Senate, when it was established, when Hillary Clinton led initiative established the Senate India Caucus in 2004, I think there was a greater understanding and belief that this angle of the relationship could be explored further, and that culminated in the 2006 Hyde Act and the 2008 India-U.S. Nuclear deal. So I think, again, as I said, India choosing to adapt to the immediate trends of the Congress was what was vital here, because in 1970s throughout the 80s, this sense of committee subcommittee culture was not adequately utilized. But India was spot on when it was catering to the post 1994 Congress with the establishment of caucuses and dealing with informal groupings. And I think that really worked out well, culminating in the ease of tensions in 1998 and the 2008 civil nuclear bill.
Right. So it's very interesting how you mentioned that there was very active lobbying by the diaspora and the creation of the India caucuses. In fact, I think the Senate India caucus was the first country specific caucus at the time. So clearly, we've seen that India was also quite strategic in engaging the Congress directly. So, also moving on from the 1990s, there was obviously globalization and economic reforms in India, which I assume led to a more positive view of India sort of embracing, liberal market reforms. But apart from that, were there any deeper institutional or systemic forces that reshaped the congressional perceptions towards India?
They largely believe that US Congress would focus on any country with which the US would have some kind of cultural ties, economic interests, or geopolitical interests. And in India's case, for a majority of the time, all three of these were absent, because Indian subcontinent was largely peripheral in US strategic calculus of the time, especially during the Cold War. People to people ties in India wasn't as strong as, say, people to people ties with US and European countries, or people to people ties between US and, say, even Israel. So there were many limitations in that sense. And even in terms of enemies or rivals, India always chose to remain neutral and not act as a partner, or was viewed as was not ever viewed as a partner that US could rely on. But all this gradually changed throughout the 90s and the 2000s, right? With the coming up of China emerging as India's natural rival, and the rival US wanted to concentrate on firstly. Then with the war on terror, the Indian subcontinent became a central hub that should be focused on, which eventually transitioned into the US Indo-Pacific strategy as well. Then if we look at the other component, India's economic growth was also, key in that regard. So I think that is how India emerged as a key element within the U.S. Congress, and I think it has more to do with the knowledge sources of the Congress as well, because. Obviously, the better understanding of a culture would lead to better focus and better legislation. And in India's case, that only came with the emergence of a diaspora and the related lobbies since the 90s. So, in that sense, if you look at it, the systemic factors that would largely direct the relationship is firstly, initially it was led by the British Empire, because the perspectives that the US Congress had, or US in general held of India, came from its perceptions of the British Empire. Although the presidency and the executive focused on a more liberal strategy of looking at the world differently, the larger congressional perceptions reflected that of the learnings they got from the British Empire. So the British perspective was central, as we see in the case of how US hyphenated India Pakistan, dealt with the different questions of India's regional consolidation after the independence. Following that, immediately Soviet Union also emerged as another key systemic factor that way, because India's relationship with Soviet Union was always looked down upon by the hawks, especially in an era where there was a strong pushback from the hawks, with anyway contributing to rise in Soviet influence. So development of India and furthering of India was viewed as a net negative for the United States by the Congress, because of India's larger more philosophical alignment with the Soviet Union in terms of its economic direction, and larger anti-Western, anti-imperialist narratives. Then we also have a very interesting role played by Israel, because initially a lot of members within the Congress that belong to the Israel lobby, they, like Emmanuel Seller and Jacob Jeftes, they were very vital in establishing India's role within the Congress. But India's disagreement with Israel on the question of Palestine in the initial years and all of that slowly pushed away this kind of support, and pushed away the largest, most active lobby on the Hill during that time, and even today, if we can say that. And when India decided to get back to the United States after the disintegration of Soviet Union, Israel was the way forward, wherein Indian diaspora members often collaborated with Israeli diaspora and the Jewish diaspora at large to get that kind of favor and align on key issues. And this was also seen in the larger diplomacy under the Prime Minister Narasimha Rao's government, wherein they used Israel as a diplomatic gateway to get United States to trust them. Then there is also the larger issue of Pakistan hyphenation, because Pakistan has a very interesting relationship with the United States, wherein since the start it was either part of different alliances that US led as part of its Cold War processes, or like CENTO and SEATO, which by the end of 1970s, both of these alliances had disintegrated and vanished. But and it was believed that Pakistan might probably lose its leverage with the United States. But in 1979, when the USSR decided to intervene in Afghanistan, the relevance of Pakistan again emerged, because US decided to use Pakistan as a base for its operations in Afghanistan. And this kind of interest continued and continues even till today, with China playing a role in leveraging Pakistan. So always US decided that would be a wise strategy to club both India and Pakistan, as a hyphenated process, which India very strongly fought against for many years and was largely successful since 2011, after which the US-Pakistan relationship also deteriorated. So that is one important systemic factor that also influenced the relationship. Then we obviously have China, as I discussed earlier. As China's threat rose, India-US partnership got stronger because the US Congress directly saw some kind of benefit out of it.
Right. So, coming to the present, Abhishek, 2025 was sort of a low point for India US ties, whether that was because of Operation Sindoor, then Trump's tariffs, which were some of the harshest towards India. How did Congress respond to these tensions last year?
I think Congress was the anchor of the relationship to a very large extent throughout this period of turmoil, because although the administration and the executive at large offered some kind of a rhetorical support to India that the relationship is fine and we are still committed to Quad, the administration has actively undermined Quad, first by constantly postponing the Quad leaders summit, and also by actually narrowing down the focus of working groups within Quad, as pointed out by Dhruv Jaishankar during one of the congressional hearings. So the administration has actively worked in a way to sideline Quad in that way, and larger India partnership has also taken a lower priority with the ongoing tensions and US attempt at somewhere repositioning its strategy towards China from a direct confrontation to an extent deterrence and larger economy focused strategy to counter Chinese influence. If you having said that, if you look at Congress has remained consistent on its ground of the positions it held from say 2015, where it viewed India as a strong, if not the strongest, counterweight to China in that region, because a lot of congressional hearings repeatedly mention India as having that kind of political will, which no other partner in the region might have in countering China. And with that, the Congress has even this year passed several laws, be it through the National Defense Authorization Act or the State Department and Defense Department of Defense slash War appropriations bills. It has actively attempted to strengthen India-US partnership, primarily not only through Quad but also otherwise through more bilateral discussions and bilateral agreements in that sense. Then this year is also important for the Indian diaspora in Congress, because this year led to the election of the highest number of members of Indian origin to the US Congress, that is six, which was vital in the 119th congressional session. Then this year also saw the establishment of congressional study group on India, which leads to greater legislative exchange between both the countries, and especially the CSGI, the congressional study group. It was vital because it came around July when the tensions were at its peak. So there is a long within the Congress there is obviously this sense, and this Congress is Republican through and through. So within this Congress there is a clear sense that the tensions with India are only short term, and in the long term they will emerge as partners, and that is what they have pushed. They have pushed for integrated defense industrial cooperation, space and critical tech cooperation, and even on tariffs they were trying to push bills which were supportive of Indo-Pacific partnerships and countries in the Indo-Pacific being away from or being refrained from getting tariffed by the administration. Yes.
Right. You seem quite optimistic and bullish about the relationship, which is great. So, looking ahead, how do you see the partnership evolve, at least from the Congress's perspective? We've already seen some positive movement this year with talks about a trade deal. Of course, the details are still unknown. But going ahead, do you anticipate deeper cooperation, or do you anticipate more friction? As you mentioned, the Quad, we still don't know whether a leader summit is happening this year. It's been delayed for a while. So, what should we really be watching in Washington?
So I think the post 2008 phenomena in Washington has been largely partisanship. With the growth of hyper-partisanship, the India-US relationship has also been dragged. And despite being or seeming optimistic about the occurrences that might have taken place in 2025, I believe that if we look at the partisanship which directs this relationship, the issues will be more clear, because there are sections within the Republican Party who strongly oppose India in the areas of tariffs, trade, and larger immigration, while supporting India on a more strategic scale as a counterweight to China and as a natural partner and things like that. Similarly, on the side of the Democratic Party are critical of the Modi government. They're critical of India's human rights conditions, democratic and political rights, and civil speech, civil liberties, and that kind of thing. While looking at India as a natural partner because of democratic alignment and institutional alignment. So it is clear to assume that there is some kind of partisan drag on that is reflected on India-U.S. Relations time and again, as we had seen more prominently during the Biden administration, and and before that, the Democratic Congress that held hearings on different legislations passed within India, like CAA and abrogation of Article 375, among others. So there is a partisan push, but the congressional strategy to counter it is what leaves me more optimistic, because the Congress this time has chosen a strategy to further siloed structure of sectoral engagement, which basically identifies sectors that India-US can cooperate on very strongly and silos them away from any kind of external disturbances by embedding them in some kind of formal frameworks or institutional structures. And this is what has proven to be resilient even during the tumultuous time with the Trump administration of the past year. So having said that, but Congress today is also going through a very transformative phase, because with the Trump administration strategies against immigration, the Epstein investigation that is going on, and larger issues of War Powers Act and everything, Congress is trying to reestablish its credibility, regain its lost power and its institutional authority, which it has lost since 1990s, and more importantly, gain that public trust. So this will eventually lead to catastrophic changes within the US Congress, because it would emerge as it has a great potential today, and shows a great desire to emerge as a strong counterweight to executive excesses. And if that succeeds, I think India's strategy should be more strongly focused on directly investing and cultivating congressional members and diplomatically engaging more strongly with the Congress. But since this flux settles down or gives hints of settling down, there is actually nothing we can say up until then. But the future prospects do look positive as of now, but it would entirely depend on the congressional role going forward.
Right. Thank you so much, Abhishek. For our listeners, if you want a deeper dive into this discussion, please refer to Abhishek's document on the Takshashila website. Also, do not forget to subscribe to his newsletter, the DC Dossier, that tracks US foreign policy and specifically developments and congressional legislations that impact India. Thank you so much, Abhishek, for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Vanshika.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.